Okay, Kainai and welcome and greetings to everyone this evening, and thank you for making your time to come and listen to some stories from the Naapi or Blackfoot perspective. And I want to thank the U of L and Lisa Vermer and Josephine Mills and John Oxley for their for reaching out and also getting things going and to really begin this the sharing of our knowledge. So one of the things that I've really beginning to really see out in the outer communities off the reserve is that there's really a lack of our traditional knowledge, and of course because it's not written. So today in our day and age we're starting to use modern technology to capture all of those stories, because a lot of those stories really revolve around our environment, and one of the things that Dr. Leroy Little Bear mentioned a few weeks ago is, when we greet each other, there's a few types of greetings that we use, and one of them we use is Sa'anita. And there's also another one that is used, it's Sa'anitsi. And both of these have different meanings for different situations. But the first one, Sanitapi, is a really common phrase that we use. And, Leroy was talking about, it's not necessarily like yourself, but it's yourself within the environment. How are you within the environment? Mainly your connection. How strong is it? And so these are the things that, when you're looking at traditional knowledge, it's a lot of it is based outside, outdoors. So in Western knowledge, a lot of it occurs in a building, and everything that want to learn within the world, outside world is all within those walls. But the thing with that traditional knowledge, it's outside, and that's how it always has been, or ever will be, because there is no other system other than the traditional way of system, other than the Western way. So for myself, I've been really, I've been around for a while to see a lot of different changes, and knowing that weather plays a really important part in our history, and especially in the Naapi or the Blackfoot worldview, weather is right. It's a part of our environment, that connection we have to it. We feel it every day. When we go outside, you feel it. You cannot live without weather, because that's the whole environment. That's what we call stiko. Weather is what we call stiko. And there's really no word for weather, but basically stiko means the day. How's the day? If it's a nice day, well, then you would add good in front of it. Stiko. Or if it's going to be a rainy day, you would say no stiko. No means it's going to be unpleasant type of weather. So, but all of those really play a factor in a lot of the history of, but from where I come from, I'm again from Gannis-Taco. And working with the Kainai Ecosystem Protection Association, just within the last few years, but really what I've noticed, in the past, 15 years is a really change in the weather, where you can't really predict things that you used to be able to with the weather. You were able to predict when to start planning, but now, winter comes all at once and it's gone, and there's long stretches of drought or heat. So these are the things that we have to start really adapting to. So for the work I do, it's Naapi's garden and Katoyiss seed bank. And that, really depends on the weather, with anything. Especially you're growing, some plants and whatnot. So for what I'm doing is that's a big part of it. And also to understand the weather and how to work with it. Because now it's getting very unpredictable. So we need to start sort of adapting to these situations of long-term, drought or, whatever, rain. So for myself, with Naapi's Garden, I work in the area of restoration and reclamation and education. And it's to educate the community, but also school children. I work with the preschool. You'll see some photographs of them later in the presentation. But a lot of the teaching that I do involves a lot of science. And of course, science involves the weather. So for myself, when I was younger, I had to, me and my older brother, we had to walk almost about a mile to catch the bus. And we had to haul water, for about a mile. So these are things that I grew up with, chopping wood, and all that type of work, it's done regardless of the weather. You have to do it. And when you start looking back in history, hundreds and thousands of years ago, that was just a part of life. Some would say a struggle. I say a struggle now, but back then it was just a part of life. There was no clocks to sort of rule your day. Back then it was, days were long. So one of the things that when I initially started to think about the story I'm going to tell tonight was about, I guess, you can't tell a story without the beginning, starting at the beginning. So in this case, which I always do, I always start from the beginning. So I have a presentation that I'll share with you that basically it talks about the history, again, the origin of weather. Can you see the screen?
Yep, we can see it. Thank you.
So, so thanks again for tuning in and taking your time, I know a lot of you have a busy day, and to listen to, some stories, but, it's some knowledge too. You'll also learn from, the way we I guess how we deal with the weather, because I'll get to the story. So for weather, like I mentioned, it's the only word closest to that is tiko, because weather basically is the day within, the weather's within the day. They go hand in hand, so it's tiko. And that word tiko, day, has a lot of other different meanings. Later we'll get to that. So some of the presentation I have, it has labels, and some of them they're just photographs, because in this case, I would like, in this case, a lot of it is to use oral, the oral transfer of knowledge. So long ago, before everyone was created here on the world, on the earth was just covered with grass. So it was just this green ball of grass. And the sun, you see him up in the corner, would transform himself into a human. And he'd be a person, and he would walk around on the earth. So eventually, after a period of time, he started to feel lonesome, because all he did was just walk. And this is basically, he'd walk and walk. And it was nice though, soft grass, it smelled good. So he wanted to create a partner. So he created his partner. So then they began to live on the land. And from there, this is where it leads into the story, basically the origin of how this world came to be. And this is a story of Itsikam. That's the 7 stars. So long ago, Okina, that's the younger one, she's on the right, and her older sister were out on land one day. In this story that I'm going to tell, for the ones that may know, what the story I'm beginning to tell, it's usually a male, but in this story it's a female, and her name is Okina. So that time they were out on the land, and Okina and her sister had other brothers, 6 others, and they were out hunting. So while they were out hunting, the older sister told Okina to go hunt some birds. We call them sistsies. These are the type of birds that we can eat. And these would be like the pitupi or the prairie chicken. So eventually, while she was out hunting, she came upon her sister. And what she saw behind that in the woods was that her sister was playing with a huge snake. Every once in a while, that snake would appear human. In this story, on the other version of this story, the older sister is talking to an elf. But we will stick with the first story. So seeing that, what her mom was doing, what her mom was doing, she ran home. She went and told her brothers, this is what I'd seen our mom doing. And that she was planning to harm them. So they went running. Eventually, their mother noticed that they hadn't returned from home, so she was looking and eventually went to go look for them. She caught up with them and she was telling them that, that she was going to harm them for running away, and especially Okina for catching her with that big snake. So they kept running and running. So then Okina remembered that his father each gave them different types of medicine to use, different types of things for each of them to use, and when it came time to use them. So the youngest one had the power of his fingers. Each of these individuals of the stars, each of them, of the people there, all have different types of gifts were given to them. So the first one was named Use His Finger, and he had the power to create canyons. So he created all these different types of canyons, and they were really wide and deep, and that's what slowed their mom down. So basically, they slowed their mom down in order to get way ahead of them. But they began to create a lot of different places here on the land. It started to transform, and a lot of that is written on some of these rocks here. So they went running. They kept on running away from their mother. Eventually, she was catching up to them. So the next individual had the power of wind. The person's name was Bladder of Air, and he was given a bladder filled with air. So what he did was, when it came time, he opened it up and caused this great wind. So it's really hard to take pictures of wind, but this is a Chinook art, and it was really blowing hard that day. So this is what also slowed their sister down, the strong winds that come from the mountain. And of course, the sister caught up to them again. And the next individual had the power of rocks. He threw the rock on the ground, and up through the ground came these huge, huge rocks, mountains, all of them poking up from the ground, and some of them resembling chiefs who are looking up into the sky. Similar to like our chief mountain we call Ninastico. You can imagine it's a chief laying down with his body to the left and his head and headdress. You can see it right there. And there's remnants of Ohpoto, or what they call small rock. This is a rock that chased Naapi, and it still exists today, but the weather is starting to really wear it down. It used to be a larger rock. But no matter where you look, you can see the spirit of Naapi. Almost in every crevice, and like in this, you can see a silhouette of him, like a profile shot. So they got much further again. And then the sister started to catch up again, and the other one was named Short Stick. And he was Sis, and he had the power of creating trees. So he puts the stick that he had, he stuck it into the ground. And out of the ground, all of these trees are, all of these forests were created. Vast areas of forests, and that's what slowed their mom down. So they kept running and running. Eventually, it just started, they just couldn't get away from them. So then Bladder, the other person was named Bladder of Water. And in that bladder was water, and it was the power of rain, Suta. So Bladder of Water, he dumps that he caused the rain. It just started to rain, and it was, you know, the rains that we have, there's thunder, there's lightning, and this is when it was created, you know, these types of things. So at the end, usually after every storm, you see a rainbow. And when you see a rainbow, that's something that, you know, the elders would say, and we still say today, that Naapi has lassoed the storm, and that's his lasso. It's many different colors. So on and on they ran, kept running, and finally, sister caught up again, and then beautiful bird, also known as Matsuwak, the small bird, had the power of thunder and lightning. So along with this, with the power of Suta, they created these storms. And these were things that scared their mom, and it slowed her down even more. All this power, immense power, that connection that there is with the land into the sky and into space. And this is that whole thing that can't happen without weather. So eventually they all, you know, kept going and deciding, you know, when their sister does catch up again. So eventually, the last one, Okina, had the power of water, of oceans and lakes. So she emptied that bladder of all of that. So now that's where we have the oceans and lakes. So they were quite away from their mother. And they got to the point where they were so far away, and they knew at some point their mom may reach them. The brothers told Okina, what should we do? And Okina said, well, you know, what we will do is where we will stand in the future, people will always see us. They'll always remember the story of how things were created here on this earth, and how we are connected to, from the land through the environment and into space. And all of us are all created the same thing. We're all created with rocks. We're created by stars. So this is what, you know, this is just one of the, you know, many stories that we have within our, you know, our history. Because the thing with this story is that what you see here are basically what builds and makes up this whole earth. And with all of that is weather. None of that would have really been able to happen without weather. And each of these individuals, these children, were given the power to create that. And even that, you know, our dogs are even in this constellation, which is the Big Dipper, by the way, Ursa Major. And when they were running, one of these kids had a dog. So that dog is really small. And when you do look at that particular star, you'll see a smaller star, a fuzzy star behind it. That's a galaxy behind that. So knowing all of these kids that basically built the world the way it is today, you know, is that connection from where they are now. We'll always remember that. And that's not really known, because there's different versions of this story. And all of them basically, you know, have these children running from their mother. Sometimes it's their sister, but in this case, it's their mother because, eventually, history started to unfold from there. And you see the Opokaa'sin Katoyiss, or the North Star. We call that the turnip star as well. And that's another story. So a lot of our connection that we have, we still, we tell them stories like even today. So ever since then, the Dipper, Itzigam are well out of the way of their mother. So the mother is concentrating on chasing after her husband, not to see the son. And that is what we see to this day. She's chasing after him, catching up with him. And if you look at the Kukumiki, so the moon, and you see a figure in there, that's the moon's wife. And her part of her leg is cut. And the reason for that was to basically also, once the children were able to slow their mom down and were able to be out of reach from them, so she concentrated on her husband, and it got to the point where she almost catches up to him. So what he did was basically he cut part of her leg off. So her original name is Kaksika, or severed leg. And so she disappears for 4 days out of the month, and she reappears to start chasing again. But in our history, those 4 days that she's not in this, we don't see her. Not to see, the sun comes down to the land, and he basically just tends to whatever needs to be done, helps out, and helps history unfold. But at some point, what was going on, the chase would never stop. So eventually, he created somebody to take over the work out on that land, and that was Naapi. And this is when Naapi was created, to take over his work. And in this case, with a lot of the Naapi stories that we tell, a lot of those stories, he's really done a lot of things to the land. So, and with that, so this is a map of the constellations so far that have been collected. And all of these are actual Western constellations. And you can see the Dipper there. So, this is where I like to start stories from, is from the start, right from the beginning, because, there's a timeline that our stories fall into, especially the Naapi stories. So that story that just ended, Itzigam. So when you look at the work of the Dipper of the 7 stars, it's everywhere. And we still, we still have that connection. We still show that in our teepees. We call it Katoyiss. And in this case, you see a teepee here. And at the bottom, you see are the points that represent mountains. And those are the colors of the spirit world above of that, or they would call the dream world. The light blue band, the dark blue band, that's the dream world or spirit world. That's where a lot of the designs would be put there. And a lot of designs were either would come through a dream or a gift, or you would have your own, to design. But, in this case, you can't just design your own teepee. There's protocols to follow. So in this case, you can see the top of the teepee, and you see the Pleiades, and that's a cluster of 7 stars on the left, that teepee ear flat. On the opposite side of that is the Itzigam, or the 7 stars, and that opens up to the heavens. That's a connection. And with that too, with what you see here is our Opokaa'sin. This is our Opokaa'sin Lodge. A lot of, it's also referred to as our Sundance, but it's not that. There's we call it the circle camp, but so we call it Opokaa'sin. So this is something that would be built towards the end of that. But this is also something that really depends on like the weather as well. When this is going on, it seldom rains. So a lot of times the heat is a big factor. And that's a part of the whole ceremony around Opokaa'sin is enduring the elements in every season. But in this is also a celebration of, the gift that Naapi received, the Opokaa'sin, and that Sundance, was given to Scarface by the sun. And so we still do that to this day. We still do the Opokaa'sin. And no matter what, whatever stories we tell in our culture, it's always got something to do with the weather. Any story, and the way it looks too, looks pretty scary at times, but just to show you that it's, that connection we have. Without that, we can't really exist, because we have to have that. And the thing too is, the science of it all too. And teaching the kids that I work with how all of this works together and why, because it's because of weather. And it's really cool to see weather in action, like this particular cloud moving in. And even the lodge here, this is the teepee of the Opokaa'sin Early Intervention Society. I work there, and it's one of the best jobs that I've ever had. And it's working with the children, because they're engaged. And for me, it's a with any culture, it's always, you start with the younger kids, the preschool, and this is what's going on, but also teaching them a lot of all these land-based lessons, all the science behind that, why we have rain, snow, wind, and that's all about part of their learning, because we have to learn that. Regardless of the elements, the learning is still outside. So the children built this little dwelling in Samoyis, and it's down by the river bottom in Blackfoot. And this is where we have our lessons. So we all crowd in there and we have our lessons, whether, if it's winter, we're in there. If it's windy, like we're in there. Sometimes we're in the teepee that you saw in the previous slide. But in this case, to experience any type of history or culture or knowledge, you have to experience the weather as well, because that's a big component of that. It's the enduring and adapting to the weather, especially the way it's getting quite extreme now. So with the children here, it was quite cold, but they wanted to go out. And that's something that we would like to see, children actually wanting to go outside. So, and that's part of the other teachings that, that are taught to them, is that the weather, although it is bad, there's a limit to it. You can be out in it, but there's a limit, like I said, there's a limit to it, because when you're outside, there's always that opportunity to learn. And especially in extreme cold, you learn things quite fast. So this is a couple of years ago when I first started to work. And this is some of the kids that we built a fire and we're standing around. And so this is the other thing, it was really cold that day. But to teach them, like the elements of fire and how we can make it just out of nothing, well, having the good tools. So this is also outside again. The weather, it's not like, we don't go out below minus 12. Even that is cold, but we have a limit. And these kids, they always want to be outside. So we always take that opportunity to bring them to all of these different locations and teach them about, what they're looking at. And that what they're looking at is a ohkutup, or a rock. And that rock has been weathered by time. And, how smooth it is. And, so in teaching them about what weather does. So one of the things that I didn't include in some slides in this was with the children here. About a few weeks ago, we found sort of, I guess, an artifact, and that's something that was put there by somebody, one of our ancestors, and through time and through wind erosion, weathering away the land, it became exposed. So these are other students that were, it was raining that day. And it wasn't cold, but the rain just made everything really work because they're doing water quality testing. And it's actually better to do it outside. When it's raining, you get a lot of good results. And for myself, I was fortunate to have this lake right near my house, but it has since dried up due to the weather being too hot. These long stretches of drought. So I'm really hoping this lake fills up again because it's a really big part of the ecosystem that's out here. So one of the things that, sort of like signs that we look at when, if it's going to be a mild or cold winter. So this particular photograph is a mound built by a Misohsky or muskrat. So when they say if it's going to be their, I believe if it's going to be their, when they build their mound way out in the water, that means it's going to be a cold winter. And this is actually a particular cold winter. So these are the things that, I would look at now, because I see this almost every year, but since my lake has dried up, this is something I don't see anymore because, like I said, weather is a really big part of a lot of the things that we do, especially if it's going to be a hard or cold winter, So, but either way, yeah. So this is my neighbor. He lives in my backyard, and a lot of times, the grass is all, there's no more snow, and it's been like that for weeks, and then his guy will still be that color. So he's really at a disadvantage because of the weather, the way it's changing. And he's such an easy prey too, because, he's already, he eventually will change back, but the weather's changing too early. So like right now, even now, gophers are out. Like there's still snow, like we're in March, but the gophers are out and they're everywhere. And the weasel, these guys survive right through the winter. They don't really hibernate. But this is, one of the things that, is going to be common, but, is that they're eventually at some point in their life, these weasels will adapt. So they'll be adapting to the weather because no matter where we go, weather, and it really dictates, making these travels anywhere, But the thing about it is there's a lot of beauty in it too as well. All of the different types of colors that it gives you, especially, like the sunset. Because, it's a part of us. And how I explain that to my kiddos that I work with is that connection, we don't see it, but what connects us is oki or water. The water vapor coming from our breath. We don't see, but that's that connection to the air, to the spirit world, as you could say. And we cannot break that connection, And these are the things for when you really look at, especially animals and how they are basically, sort of like, so for instance, the eagle here, he doesn't really spend winters around here. You see a lot more of the mice too, or the raven or the crow. And that is also based on weather as well. The bald eagle or golden eagle is also has a relative, or they themselves are the thunderbird. And the thunderbird is the bird that causes thunder and lightning. And that's something that, my great aunt, Opokaa'sin, she had a lodge, and it was all painted blue. And it had 2 lightning bolts on each side of the teepee. And, that was a powerful teepee. And that, when that would be erected, one of the times that I've seen it immediately rained. So my aunt, she had that power to be able to cause that. And what Akekodak means is gold. Gold, yes, it has to do with gold because, that's another story, but, her name was Eileen Mountain Horse. She was a heavy runner, and I'm a heavy runner, and my other family is the singer. So knowing that, how powerful like weather is, and actually seeing it, because that wasn't the only time I've seen things like that. Some of these things that our people would do. And a lot of that is a lot of power, like the pita or the eagle. It really symbolizes that connection, that power and that strength. But we also see it in these plants as well. Like this is Natusi, or the wild sunflower. And the wild sunflower is a plant that grows late in the season. And the name of it is basically the sun's flower. And what this basically is all of it is edible. And this, at the end of the life cycle of the sunflower, the seeds come out of it, they develop. But prior to that, removing the petals of this particular plant and putting them in some hot water, you'll get a yellow dye. And that yellow dye is, they call the yellow color of the sun. So when you see how, all of these things, you can't be one without the other, like they're all intertwined. And a lot of this, because of this life cycle of our plants, it's the weather. It dictates their life cycle. It dictates a lot of our movements and things that we do. But with modern technology, we still live right through winter, move about, fly about. But in our case, with the original peoples, the plants and the grasses, their lives are dictated on the weather. And a lot of that change is, there's arguments about it, but a lot of it is basically what we're doing to do. And having to explain climate change to an elders, it's difficult how to explain that because, at some point, you're going to be saying, well, we're a part of that problem, So we look back in our history and we look at things what Naapi did, things that we don't want to do, don't want to happen again. So in this image here, you see Naapi, and this is after a flood that he caused. And so one of the things here is that he really changed a lot of the landscape. And he also used the weather because he was given these gifts and he got too crazy, I guess, So in this case here, this is, Ohki is something. And in the end, after, this is this is another story, by the way. So, but a lot of the stories, they happen like in wintertime. And like this particular story of Naapi, and this is Naapi was, is skating. And this is a story when he would travel to different TP camps and would do things, help them out, or sometimes, he would just go there to show off. So in this case, he was showing off, skating back and forth. And in the distance, there were some girls who were talking to him, and they asked him, he asked the girls what they were up to, and the girls told him that they were hungry. So then Naapi told them, okay, well, look over in that direction, and he began to sing. And that song, there's a song that goes with this. And my mom, she knows this song. And it's really short. And that song, when he looked at that, when he asked the women to look at the ice, he sang the song. It was, Patukiman, oh, Patukiman. So basically that means, what you're seeing right there. So all of these animals insides combusting out of the ice. And those are the what you call delicacies. You know, they're hard to come by. You know, like you can get a lot of meat from an animal, but those you can only get one or two of each. So those are something that, you know, the Naapi had a power of. And it can only happen during the wintertime. So, you know, and so from that, you know, he ended up, you know, misusing his power. And the thing with that too is, you know, knowing that, you know, what we have that power to is to be able to work and help the land. Because, you know, we all share the land, regardless of me being on a reserve and, you know, everyone else being where they are. You know, we all share the land. And, you know, like it's really up to us to really take action, you know, how to preserve a lot of these different things, because the land is affected by the weather. They go hand in hand, but it's to the point where things are really not the same way they used to be. So in the next few weeks, you'll be seeing this particular plant here, and you may recognize it. It's the wild crocus or pasquet flower. We call it Kipiapi. Kipiapi shows up before any other plant, and it's here for a very short time, which is why it's called Kipiapi, and that means soon, old man. And what this tells us, the story of this particular flower, is long time ago, you know, and it still happens. A lot of our young people would go seek a vision on a hill, whether on a mountain, cliff. And this particular young man went to the hills around here on the southwest part of the land. All he had was his buffalo robe. So he went up there and he spent all day and nothing happened. So he was ready to curl up in his buffalo robe. And then a voice told him, you know, cover me up, I'm cold. And he looked around and he saw this flower telling him to cover him up. So the boy covered up that flower and went to sleep. The next morning, the next few days, he would cover the flower up and he went to bed. So on the fourth day and fourth night, he was wondering that he hadn't seen anything yet. Going on to the fourth night, he told the flower that, you know, nothing's happened yet. So the flower told him, well, go to sleep, cover me up. So the boy covered him up and he went to sleep. And he had a dream not too long after, and that dream was that he was helping his people with a lot of the different plants that were around him. And one of the plants that was around him was the crocus, and it looked different. So when he woke up the next morning, he looked at the plant and looked at the plant after he uncovered it, and he noticed how furry it looked, and it had different colors. And so he thanked the flower for being there for him. And he told the flower that is there anything that you want. So the flower told him, I'd like to have the warmth of the yellow sun and the coolness of the blue sky among my petals, and a nice fur robe to keep me warm throughout the season, which is why the crocus has fur. It's furry because of that. So this flower couldn't really have come to be without weather. So that's how it is. And thank you for listening. And this is some of the, if you want to get in touch, these are the places you can get in touch with the work that I myself and the Kainai Ecosystem Protection Association do. We do a lot of work, and we have a summit every year. We're planning for our summit in June, I believe. Yeah, we're going to have our summit back to June. So thank you for listening.